So CMI's Peace Talks live webinar series this year focuses on key global trends shaping current and future conflicts. The ways we meet the challenges posed by these trends will define the future of peacemaking. This year's second webinar, this one, centers on conflicts that take place in cyberspace and the growing need for peacemaking to cope with these new types of conflicts. We have three speakers here today with us. I warmly welcome all of them to join this webinar. So we have Christine Bejerasco, who is currently working as the Chief Technology Officer at WithSecure. Prior to becoming the CTO for WithSecure, Christine held the position of a Vice President for F-Secure's Tactical Defense Unit. She has been with the organization since 2008 and is currently leading the team running the organization's defense services. Then we have Francesca Bosco here, who is the Chief of Strategy at the CyberPeace Institute, which is based in Geneva, Switzerland. She has a background in international law and human rights, yet she's a professional and has experience from several international institutions and has gained a lot of expertise in cybersecurity and misuse of technology. And then we have Janne Taalas, who is the CEO of CMI, Martti Ahtisaari Peace Foundation, so our institution here. And prior to joining CMI a little over a year ago, Janne worked as a diplomat and held the position of the cyber ambassador within the Finnish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we have quite a great panel here, all come to this topic of cyber conflict and peace from quite different angles, yet are extremely experienced when it comes to this theme. Before jumping into the discussion part, I have a few practical notes to share. So firstly, this webinar is being recorded and streamed on our YouTube channel, just for the record. And if you want to tweet and discuss about this webinar in Twitter, please use the hashtags digital peacemaking, hashtag peace mediation, and tag @CMI office. So we'll also know that you're contributing to the discussion online. And more on the practical side of things, so we'll have the beginning of the session's first 45 minutes for discussion amongst us. So I'll be moderating and steering the discussion with the panelists here today. And then in the end, we'll leave some 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers from the audience. Please share these questions via the chat, and I'll read them from there at the end, or towards the end of this session. But without further ado, I think it's time to jump into the discussion part. Just a few words of background information and introduction, and then I'll go into the questions themselves. So cyber conflicts and therefore cyber peace, these are definitely topics that receive great interest today. Increasing access and thus the use of digital technologies globally have made this frontier of conflict more visible to us all, as cyber attacks as a form of a hybrid warfare have become more and more common. In addition, the recent events, including the war in Ukraine, have shed light on new forms of cyber warfare after the country's government called on hackers across the globe to join the digital fight against Russia. So during this webinar, while tackling these questions of cyber peace and conflict, we will thus discuss the basics of cyber conflict and what every peacemaker should know about this topic. We are, for example, looking into what can a peacemaker do in order to address cyber conflicts, the roles information security and digital risk management play in protecting peace processes from cyber attacks and being influenced by cyber conflicts, and then whether we'll try to figure out an answer to the question of whether cyber peace can actually be reached. So my first question to you, dear panelists here today, is what is cyber conflict and why should peacemakers pay attention to conflict in cyberspace? You can also reflect a bit on what are the most common means for cyber conflict or cyber warfare these days. And I'd love to start today with Francesca. What will you say?
Thank you so much, Aino, and thanks a lot for the invite. Actually, I think that sharing with you a couple of reflections, definitely peacemakers need to strengthen their understanding of the risk and on the other hand, also drive meaningful change and impact for the benefit of, let's say, it's a timely debate to have. And what I would like to highlight is the need of understanding of like three key dimensions. On one hand, how the technologies are used in conflict situations, including, for example, support or services provided by third parties. Understanding how international law, norms, and other relevant measures can offer a framework for agreements or peace settlements, as you very well said, and also identifying the range of actors that directly or indirectly have responsibilities in the particular conflict. The cyber, let's say, dimension is kind of like challenging all of these three key aspects. And I would like to share with you just some, let's say, quick considerations on the dimension of, let's say, cyber conflict, cyber warfare, and the interaction, let's say, between technology and peace mediation. First, a thorough understanding of how conflicts are being shaped by technology is essential to recognize the risk. So the purpose for which technologies are used by different actors in the conflict environment might range from, for example, disinformation, misinformation, incitement to violence through hate speech, but also surveillance, or, for example, control and intelligence gathering, or, for example, we've seen attacks to critical infrastructures. Second aspect is to consider the fact that kind of like space and time are altered in cyberspace. What I'm saying is that all conflicts nowadays happen partially in cyberspace. This has impact on, let's say, real-time dimension of conflict, but often part of the cyber operations might happen before, during, after what we perceive as impactful in real time. I'm mentioning this because at the CyberPeace Institute, we've been aggregating data on cyber attacks against two sets of targets related to the conflict in Ukraine, critical infrastructure in Ukraine and the Russian Federation, essential for the survival of civilian population, and also target outside of these two countries that might have been impacted by cyber attacks as a result of war. I'm mentioning this because when we started collecting the data, clearly in February 2022, we also tried to understand which were the cyber operations that might have impacted the cyber dimension of conflict even before. You will see in the timeline, I will share it in the chat as well, for example, some information regarding a pretty famous attack against Ukraine, the NotPetya attack, which was a wiper and malware attack happened on the eve of Ukraine's Constitution Day in July 2017, which is probably the most famous, let's say, attack against the Ukraine financial, energy, and government institution. Just before the invasion, we recorded, for example, distributed denial of service attacks on website, taking a number of Ukrainian websites offline, including those of the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, just the 15 and 16 of February. So just before the attacks. And this could be related to the invasion as they temporarily disrupted the access to this important institution. So just to mention that we need to also pay attention about the, let's say, the sequence of actions that are happening in cyberspace and the sequence of actions that are happening in real life. And just to conclude, a couple of other considerations is first is also the very challenging dimension of attribution, because clearly we've seen, especially with the recent conflict, the interaction of state, but also non-state actors. And often, since attacks are not attributed, cyber operations might also not be directly connected to what we would call cyber warfare. And just to consider two other aspects is the scale, because cyber incidents do not take place just between two nations, while other countries, let's say, silently watch. We need to remember that the internet is a global resource, and cyber operations and means, such as, for example, botnets, will employ the computer resources of other nations, making cyber warfare really, let's say, global. And then the last point that I would like to make is also to consider, unfortunately, that offensive cyber tools and capabilities are creeping also into the conflict dimension. Unfortunately, conditions in cyberspace overwhelmingly incentivize offensive strategies as opposed to defensive. So perpetrators often can act with, let's say, no warning and target specific weak spots. Like, for example, cyber defenses must be constantly monitored and updated to remain effective, while cyber operations might be perpetrated, let's say, with a sort of like related level of ease. And also the timeframes for responding to cyber attacks are kind of like shortened, especially in situations that require negotiations. So I just would like to give this food for thoughts for further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. I think you made many excellent points, and these definitely some of the latest ones that you mentioned. So the fact that the internet is a global resource and cyber operations and therefore cyber warfare, it's never local or focusing only on a certain context, but there can be operators coming from across the globe. And then I think this questions of offensive versus defensive strategies that you mentioned as well is extremely interesting, and maybe we'll have time to dive deeper into these towards the end of this session. I'd like to ask the same question from Janne, from the perspective of taking into consideration background and where CMI operates, so in this field of peacemaking more precisely. So what do you think is why peacemakers should now pay attention to cyber conflicts, and what kind of issues do you see at this front?
Thank you, Aino, and thank you for invitation. This great panel. This is really, really good, and I'm really happy to speak up for Francesca, because she starts from the kind of the tech end, and I'll try to do about the same questions from kind of the conflict end. So we're really it's good. It's good, a good fit, so to speak. I think how she ended is perfect way. I think this is the kind of problem with the conflict and with the peace in general. When you are defending, when you are doing peace, you have to succeed every time. Defense, attack, once is enough. I think that is the kind of the fundamental. This is a bit, if you want to be good, you have to be always good. But you know, it's enough to be once bad. And I think this is kind of the one of the fundamentals of trying to do peace or defense and attack. But and just to react to Francesca's point, yeah, what I said, my take on cyber conflicts. I rather speak, I think, as Francesca was moving to conflicts in cyberspace, because my kind of main point here that the cyber conflicts are not separate from conflicts. That's a fundamental point. So in a way, you cannot tackle only cyber conflicts, because they are. This is the reality. There are conflicts that kind of unfold in different domains. You might have a kind of military, you might have an aerial, you might have kind of naval action, and increasingly you have kind of cyber action. All the conflicts have now a cyber or digital kind of domain or relevance. I think that's the starting point. But at the same time, if we want to resolve them, we cannot resolve them only. It's the same that you will, there is a kind of naval fighting or somewhere, and you just try to do a naval means to resolve that. So you have to always look at the root causes of the conflict. I think that is something that is absolutely crucial. So in a way, rather similar ways to approach with the conflicts are relevant, but you have to understand what unfolds in the kind of the cyber domain. And that makes it extremely difficult. This kind of extension of conflict, and well, Francesca excellently described, there are new kind of elements and new time and space and how it kind of unfolds. And this is where the peacemakers, we are not yet good enough to understand. And I think that's my point, that it's just kind of extension of the existing conflict resolution strategies that we have to apply. What follows from that also, I think there is an important point. Important point is that criminal activity, what we see in all the conflicts, basically all the conflicts that we're dealing with, the longer the conflict lasts, the more you have the criminal elements involved. So you have all kinds of exploitation of resources, illegal exploitation of resources. You have all kinds of trafficking issues. But this is something that modern conflicts, there's a kind of other axiom that I would like to put to you. Modern conflicts are more and more involved in the kind of criminal activities or criminal economic activities. And that's what we see in the cyber world, even more so, that you have kind of criminals coming in and out and partly using the kind of unlawful situation to do their kind of nasty things, at the same time infiltrating maybe the belligerent parties or something, or de facto authorities. But this is what we see, and I think that's what I'm quite concerned in the cyberspace, and that we have to be very, very kind of very careful when we're dealing with the cyber areas, because it's very difficult for a criminal actor kind of masquerading or entering the conflict with kind of claimed legitimacy as a fighting for something. In the matter of fact, they are only looking for the economic gain, and that's something we have to be. I'm not sure that people have been kind of reacting, understanding this, and really the kind of the intertwined of crime and conflict, and now how it is aided by the cyberspace. I think that would be something. That point I would like to raise. My third point is something that, and these are quite general, but I just want to really frame the discussion also, is that we have spent lots of time to discuss the kind of the norms and the responsible state behavior in the cyberspace. And it's interesting because we have spent enough, as Aino said, I spent a few years sitting behind the Finland sign and then negotiating on these issues. Most of the focus has been focusing on under the threshold of military action. That this is kind of in a way in a civilian situation, and I think the Ukraine is extremely interesting situation. Interesting is just, I shouldn't say it's awful, horrible situation, but it creates a new situation that we have a cyber action as a part of a legitimate military action. And to be honest, we haven't had that before. And that's something that kind of, and that we will see more of that. And I think that's kind of in the norm sense, and in the sense of how you understand that, how we go forward. I think that's something we have to recognize, that for the first time, we now are dealing with the cyber activities as a part of traditional warfare. Most of our kind of cyber norms were created for trying to kind of regulate the gray area between the kind of the overt military action and the kind of civilian use. But now we are a bit of a kind of new situation, and I think that's something that we have to, in the kind of normative and how we are deal with that. But I think this would be kind of my kind of opening ambits, and this is situation where we are in, and how the kind of cyber conflict, as Francesca described from the tech side, I'll just describe from the kind of the conflict side. But thank you.
Thank you, Janne, for your thoughts as well. Then I'd love to jump to Christine, maybe extending the question a bit. So I'm happy to hear your quick reflections on like from the perspective of representative of a private sector, what are the kind of central elements of conflicts in cyberspace that you see, but also where does the private sector, where will the companies such as WithSecure stand in this kind of a situation? I'm interested to hear like what can a private sector organization do when it comes to these conflicts in cyberspace? Off to you, Christine.
Thank you, Aino. So to add a little bit of my reflections as well, what Francesca and Janne have already mentioned. So Janne has mentioned about cyber conflicts that are not separate from an actual conflict. And that is definitely true. So we need to understand that cyberspace today is now just another dimension where our assets exist. And just like this happens with private citizens, when they get their password stolen, it can happen with organizations that are supporting different governments, such as private contractors as well, where they get targeted via targeted attacks, as well as non-governmental organizations. So whenever you have your assets in cyberspace, and we have our assets that are defined in there today are our devices, our data, our networks, for instance, our people, our users of these devices. So if these assets are there, it's merely a question of what are the data that these users can access? What type of data is this? And how useful is this to the targeting entity? And when it comes to nation state attackers, the motivation that they have is not money. The motivation that they have can be sabotaging a certain endeavor or getting information, harvesting information for intelligent purposes. And we also need to understand that cyber attacks come first before the bombs in the real world. So beyond cyber attacks during war, as I mentioned, what happens during what we call peacetime, there could be cyber sabotage. So Francesca has mentioned about NotPetya, which happened around 2017. Stuxnet in 2010, which was targeted against Iran, is also cyber sabotage, where they were destroying the centrifuges that were used for uranium enrichment. So it sabotages the uranium program that Iran actually had. And the thing with cyber attacks that we need to understand is that they are very approachable. You don't need millions in budget in order to launch a cyber attack. You need, even if you just have one expert hacker with a really good internet connection and some decent tools to hide the attack and to show that it may not come from the place where it really originated from, that's already sufficient to launch an effective cyber attacks. And it brings me to the point as well that cyber attacks, they can be very deniable. So if it looks like it comes from one country, it can be framed where it may look like it's coming from another country. So you don't really, you are not able to immediately respond in kind because you need to validate if it's really true, if it's coming from that area. And Francesca mentioned about NotPetya. This deniability can even extend to cloaking that certain attack, because NotPetya was pretending to be a ransomware, but it wasn't. It was a wiper, but it was leaving behind it ransom notes, as if you can pay in Bitcoins and then you can recover your master boot record, because it was overwriting the master boot record of the device, but you actually couldn't. So when you first approach it as an analyst from the private sector, for instance, you might think, okay, this is just another cyber criminal gang. But once you research and look behind the scenes and what you understand what it's really trying to do, then you start attributing it to nation state, because cyber criminal gangs don't end up benefiting from the type of malware. So in conclusion, I would just like to leave behind to the group that we are seeing cyber sabotage and cyber espionage all the time. So when it comes to certain countries that may not officially be in conflict, there are cyber espionage attacks. For instance, the non-Haishu attack that we have seen also a few years back between China and Philippines over the South China Sea conflict. It was targeted against a legal organization that was representing the Philippines at the time. And harvesting data related to this attack is also a very real benefit to the nation state that was attacking. So for us who are trying to hold the fort on this, let's expect that this attack will be normalized. This type of attack will be normalized all across the different countries. And it's just a matter of time before other countries are going to join in. Because today, there are major players, but there are not a lot of players in these cyber attacks. But in the future, we're getting more and more satellite connectivity. We're going to have 5G across the different countries globally. And once these countries who didn't have access before to high-speed internet come online, there's going to be more and more players in this space, and we need to anticipate it.
Definitely. I mean, anticipation is key. And I think in the anticipation and building these different strategies to respond to conflicts in cyberspace, the collaboration between different entities and different parts of the organizational landscape is also a necessity. And therefore collaboration between the private sector, the organizations such as CMI, but then also civil society. And here I would like to hear a few reflections from Francesca. So what do you think is the role of civil society in this whole picture of responding to conflicts in the cyberspace?
Thank you so much. And actually, thanks a lot to both Janne and Christine for, let's say, for adding the pieces of an extremely complex puzzle. And I think I would like to take, let's say, one consideration before, which is also the role of information security in protecting, let's say, the peace process itself, also from attacks, and considering all these aspects that have been highlighted regarding this complex scenario. I think there is also one consideration that we need to make in terms of which is the individual and organizational, let's say, kind of a responsibility also for peacemakers when they act into this scenario. So first of all, I'm very well said by Janne in mentioning the, let's say, the cyber-physical dimension. So protecting from cyber threats also impact the physical security, and every peacemaker needs to master the essential of cybersecurity nowadays. And everyone is in the front line when it comes to cybersecurity, especially because of the let's say, the kind of a gray zone, considering the different actors that are now impacting the cyberspace dimension, as very well Jan highlighted, for example, thinking about also criminal actors that tend to benefit from those who have least awareness of digital risk and cyber hygiene. So for sure, let's say, boosting this, let's say, cyber capabilities when it comes to individual action, but also when it comes to the organizational awareness. And this goes also back to what Christine was mentioning, also in terms of the fact that due to the increased use of technology in the peacekeeping and mediation field, we need to be conscious about the impact of those technologies, for example, in terms of the use of data. And the large amount of data captured places a tremendous power in the hands of those holding and analyzing those data. And also, on one hand, we need to consider the potential collective data harms. So for sure, we need to well handle data. On the other hand, we need to make sure that those data are not clearly exploited by the different parties in the conflict. I'm mentioning this because one of the activities that we as a civil society organization are doing is to support other civil society organizations active, for example, in the humanitarian context. I want to mention two quick, very practical examples. One is supporting in understanding, elevating the knowledge, and also raise awareness about the impact and the harm that cyber attacks are causing to civilian populations. And this is the timeline that I shared in the chat. So one function is for sure, let's say, to help understanding that behind the cyber attacks, there are people. And there are, let's say, concrete impact on our societies and on people that are already, let's say, struggling with the constraint caused by the conflict. And second point is how we can support other civil society organizations, for example, that are active in the field. We have one specific program that is called the CyberPeace Builders, by which we are supporting civil society organizations in boosting their cyber capability. Many civil society organizations, including, for example, mediation, peace mediation organizations, do not have, let's say, the means, the capabilities, the knowledge, understanding, the awareness, the skill set, and the tools for dealing with such a complex and ever-evolving cyberspace, let's say, conflict dimension. And therefore, we are supporting them with the pre- and post-incident response, and also with the sort of like a long-term capacity building exercises. On top of this, we are also engaging in a regular conversation, both with private sector companies and with the security is a very good example, and with civil society organization, also to understand how we can best define tools, technical tools, when it comes to being active and supporting civilian populations in, for example, a conflict situation. So, I mean, I just wanted to highlight two very concrete examples of how we can support. And then just one last point regarding to what Janne was mentioning before, civil society organization can also have a key role in raising the voice of civil society when it comes to international policy and debates, like, for example, UN processes, and namely, I would like to mention the open-ended working group, or, for example, when it comes to the United Nations group of governmental experts that have been pretty key in defining, for example, the dimensions of responsible behaviors in cyberspace, and that are currently challenged clearly with the current conflict. And we are very active in, for example, submitting our position, trying to raise awareness on which are the key aspects, like, for example, the harm caused on society and on the civilian populations, at also higher international debate level.
Thank you, Francesca, for these insights. I think you mentioned quite a few points on the services that you provide for other civil society organizations and organizations such as CMI that operate in the field of peacemaking. And I do acknowledge the need for raising awareness, building capacities, and providing the support for these organizations in order to respond to conflicts in the cyberspace. Maybe here, I think it will be good to hear some reflections from Janne. And so, taking into consideration what has been said thus far, what can then peacemakers do in order to respond to these conflicts, or conflicts in the cyberspace more precisely? What is what is a peacemaker's role in addressing such complex issues that we are discussing here now, when we are not necessarily even aware who are the ones initiating these conflicts, and where are they? Where do these attacks come from, and whatnot?
As we all know, that in case of loss of cabin pressure, you have to first put your own mask before you help others. I think we have all heard that so many times. So I think that's a good starting point. And I think Francesca was very well described that we have to make sure that what we do is solid and it is safe. And let's look at that. It is kind of capacity building, and many thanks for the CyberPeace Institute. Amnesty has been running a good kind of operations. There are a lot organizations that are doing a very, very good work on this, on kind of civil society. It is, and I think what CMI we did with the UN, and I think CyberPeace Institute, a kind of basic training course on cybersecurity for peace builders. I think that's something that really go and do it. That's something you first have to have a basic knowledge, and you have to be prepared to kind of think through and how to do. And there are, I was last week with the WithSecure experts. I was discussing a Pegasus of kind of phone, because we are getting more phone-related activity in the peace builders. That's something we have to be aware. And I was struck, because when I discussed, I realized that if you switch off your phone, it actually is more difficult or more expensive to keep spying on you. So you should, and this is what I learned. If you reboot, I am now rebooting my phone more often than I used to when I learned that. So I was told that running a Pegasus in a phone that reboots, that it's more, it requires more resources, it's more complicated. Small things like that. I think this is something of a real capacity building we could do, and let's see if we can do kind of more of that and work on that. And I think capacity building, and there's one point also kind of little bit beyond the peace builders and the peacemakers. Every speech I make, I was in Algeria that just discussing that you have to think what you share in the digital world. It is just all of us are peacemakers, or kind of take a stance on that, what kind of stuff you share, what kind of comments you make. I think that's kind of, as a peacemakers and citizens, there's a lots of capacity building to be done. I think that's kind of the first point, the important point. You put the mask on before you help others. What is the kind of what we can do to the others and the kind of larger conflict prevention work? I think what Francesca alluded to is, I think it is the norms are important. What we can do is, just to step back, prevention is we aim at prevention. Kind of resolving cyber conflicts, as we discussed earlier, it's difficult because they're part of the conflict. So let's try to prevent the cyber conflicts or escalation of cyber. That's really should be our aim. So we are talking about prevention here, much more. And then norms are crucial. We have responsible state behavior. We have charters. The companies have agreed that how they should behave in the cyberspace. What I said that, and exactly with Christina said that false flag operations are so easy, and it is important that the companies abide by no hackback, for example, just because it could get out of hand very quick. So there are norms that bound states and companies, and they should be observed. And that's something where they kind of be as a preventive measure. We should be very strict with the norms, and we should strengthen the norms. I think that is the number one thing how we can prevent the conflicts, and that's the civil society, international organizations. That's their job. At the same time, and I think the discussion we have with Francesca and Christine today, what I think is important in the cyberspace, kind of what helps prevention, is transparency. And this is a great discussion where we have said, what happened before the war in Ukraine? Who did what? That is something that, because that raises the price for attack and escalation. It also clarifies the situation. And this is for the civil society and commercial actors and all companies, just to be clear what is happening, who is responsible for what. And I think corollary to that, there is an important aspect of consequences, because what we have seen in NotPetya, for example, there were unintended consequences. And this is something that, because in order to prevent, you have to kind of show what happens, and you will be found out, you will be exposed, and at the same time tell that certain things get out of hand. And I think this is an important aspect of prevention, because you guys know how things spread, and that at least those who are considering these actions factor in kind of these negative externalities. They might aim at something, but something else happens, and they will be blamed on that. And I think that is, so transparency and spelling out the consequences of this kind of attacks. I think these are the important things. Thanks.
Thank you, Janne, for these points that you mentioned. So definitely you mentioned that civil society and institutions such as CMI and the public sectors will definitely work on norm setting, highlighting the importance of transparency and responding to consequences and negative externalities. At this point, I'd love to hear some reflections from Christine. So Janne talked quite a lot about conflict prevention, and then in case something happens, responding to their consequences. So taking this to a more practical level, also taking into consideration the private sector and organizations such as WithSecure, where could you be in this whole question? How do you see your role in responding then to these consequences and negative externalities? can you take part in norm setting, and how could you enhance transparency in this fight against conflicts in the cyberspace?
These are actually big questions for the private sector, and most of the time, as what we have done in the past, it's very neutral. Wherever our customers are, we protect them. Even if we are operating in a certain country and that country is performing cyber attack against another country, and we see the malware that they have been sending, we detect that malware. Today, with the crisis in Ukraine and Russia, we have taken a side. So this is a little bit of a new development. But typically, it's really all about protecting the organizations that come to us to ask for assistance. And within these organizations, there are ranges of protection capability, because we need to understand that every asset that you make digital increases the attack surface. Now, the question is, okay, should we just stick with pens and papers? Because everything, of course not, like we're not going to go there. We're not going to go back to the past, but it's good to understand where we are. And Janne also mentioned about the collateral damage that happened with NotPetya. It's also good to understand how interconnected the world is. I mean, beyond the supply chain, the physical supply chain that we see now with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the digital supply chain is hundreds of times more interconnected than that. The NotPetya showed that a certain provider of an application used for taxes in Ukraine impacts different logistics companies that are not based in Ukraine, and even other organizations that they work with. So understanding how interconnected their web is, and this web is, and appreciating that is very essential, like for all of us. And we also need to understand that cybersecurity is not just in the realm of the providers of cybersecurity. We are all part of this. And a healthy level of paranoia for all of us would be valuable, especially with the peacemakers. Assume breach, for instance, a model where it's very valuable, especially for this sector. It's healthy enough to be applied to peacemakers, that thinking that the attacker is already in your network, the attacker is already in your systems in the first place. And if they are there, what do you do? It begs the question that, okay, are all your data inside one device? Is it encrypted? How easy is it to decrypt? How easy is it to decrypt for a nation state? So these are questions that gives you thoughts to ponder, and it's good at the beginning to ask the questions rather than to get all the answers, because this is a way to sort of like search what is really valuable. We also work with organizations like CyberPeace, for instance, to figure out where are the areas where our available expertise can be utilized. So we have reverse engineering capabilities or penetration testing capabilities, that if there are organizations that have been attacked by Pegasus, for instance, as Janne mentioned, and or we didn't know it was Pegasus, but my mobile phone was behaving very weirdly the other day, what could be inside it? So those are areas that we can help analyze. But I would like to leave something kind of like very practical as a food for thought for the group, that even if this is an NGO that may not have the budget to begin with cybersecurity, and you just need to have an approach like, how do I approach cybersecurity when firstly, very technical, I don't understand it, I don't know how exposed I am, I don't know who really I should protect. And there is one concept that we're introducing, which is outcome-based security. And it's really a frame of mind, like a frame of thinking that the outcome, what is the outcome that this organization seeks? It doesn't have to be security outcomes, it needs to be organizational outcomes. For instance, the outcome to this organization would be that we'd like to ensure that the names of political activists are protected from this oppressive government. Okay, very clear outcome. Everyone in the organization can rally behind it. Next level could be to take a look at the risks. So what are the risks to this outcome? The activist could be discovered and intercepted. And then behind the risk, you look at the assets. Like, what are the assets behind these risks? And those assets could include physical assets, like where this person is living, this person himself or herself, could include mobile phones, laptops, data containing all of the activists that could be stored, I don't know, in any cloud, like Microsoft 365 emails. And then after that, that's when we talk about the threats. So if you look at it, it's a layer that you start with outcomes, you look at the risks to the outcomes, look at the assets behind those risks before you look at the threats. Because sometimes the threats, for example, to these outcomes could be that there's a spyware, like Pegasus went to the mobile phone of a certain leader of this activist group, and then his phone book now has been sent to the government, and the government would be able to identify to now start investigating, like, who are there in the contact list. Or it could be that exploits and vulnerabilities are a very real threat, especially to this type of profiles, for example, activists. So hopefully that thinking helps, because we don't need to protect everything with ironclad security. We need to protect those outcomes that we want to accomplish. Like, what are the outcomes that this organization want to accomplish? And then that is where we funnel most of the budget that the organization has. So hopefully that helps sort of like approach cybersecurity in a fashion that could be more practical as well to the organization.
Thank you, Christine, for these reflections. I'll just once more for the audience. So in case you have any questions, please do share them in the chat. I haven't thus far seen any. So I'll still ask a few questions from the panelists. But if there is anything, do send them out to me or in the chat, so we can take them from there. We still have 10 minutes of time, and I have a few just more like more practical questions. So first, taking into consideration this discussion that we've had thus far, there are two things that I'd love to ask. First is about whether or not you have, or like what kind of more concrete tips would you have? Let's say if putting these tips into 2 or 3 points, what would you say to the audience now that they can do in order to protect themselves and protect their work, or more broadly peace processes from being attacked, and kind of their work into the countering conflicts in the cyberspace? And then I'd love to know also, what is your take on whether this kind of cyber conflicts or conflicts in the cyberspace can at some point be ended? Can these kind of conflicts be solved with agreements involving different entities who are involved in these new forms of conflict? Maybe let's start with Janne this time.
Thanks, Aino. You knew that I would be saying all conflicts can be resolved,
Yeah.
because this is the CMI credo. So yeah, I think all the conflicts can be resolved. I think there is a lot we can do. I would shift the discussion and what I've tried to do in the kind of conflicts in cyber kind of dimension, in the prevention side. And then you look at the conflict resolution, because that would be my kind of big strategic key away. Look more on prevention, and then because you cannot resolve them alone. You have to resolve the underlying conflict. That would be my take. What would be the practical things? And I've tried to be very quick because we don't have that much time. Do the course that the Francesca put it on the chat. I think that would be number one. Put the mask on before you help others. I think that is crucial. Be aware, as Christine said, be aware of these issues. Assume, be a paranoid, be a kind of not over the top, not a paranoid that prevents you doing something, but be a paranoid of what you are doing. And I think what Christine said very importantly, be clear what are the most important elements. Kind of think of the security in that way. That is the way to do it. Think what is really that there are different levels. I think that was very important for Christine. So kind of have a kind of little bit of an onion that you go inside, and what is at the heart, that's what you want to protect. That would be my second point. And hey, restart your phone every now and then. That's what I learned last week. Sorry to repeat that, but just I was blown out of the water, because That's just something that it's relatively easy to do. And I think the phone security is now something that we have to think more. Thanks.
Thank you, Janne. Then I'll give the floor to Christine. So we'll end with Francesca, some final comments. Can we find an ending, or not necessarily an ending? Can we find peace in the cyberspace, and what will be kind of the last practical tip for the audience to take away from this discussion?
I'd like to be an optimist in this area, but sometimes my job makes it hard because what we have seen today is like the status is worsening. But of course, we can find peace because like behind these attacks are people. At the end of the day, these are people executing things that they believe could be valuable to them or could be valuable to the nation states that they represent. So in the beginning, to have peace between these areas means that there can be peace in cyberspace as well, because this is just one of the areas that we play in. And secondly, well, I mentioned already about the layers, and Janne reiterated it as well. But beyond that, let's remember that this is also on us. Now, there is a movement that we call shifting security left, where you don't leave security to those who are actually building cybersecurity products or trying to protect organizations, but you think about your role and what are the things that you actually produce, especially data. Like, where do you store your data? How do you store your data? Can your data be accessed in one place? And if it can be accessed in one place and you assume breach, what if that place is breached? And the person or the organization who's not supposed to see that data sees that data, what happens to them? So it's good to understand that there are tools that are able to split data into unreadable pieces, encrypt it, and able to store those into different places. And then there are also methods of authentication, like who has access to those data. So these are the type of questions that if we shift our thinking to the left, and it's really just a matter of we don't leave cybersecurity to the last layers. We think of cybersecurity at the beginning. And especially in this profile of organizations, the type of people that we have listening here today, this is a very valuable thinking. What can you do today to ensure that the data that you keep, the data that you put out there and store, are as hard as possible for potential attackers to acquire and to understand? That's what I leave to the group today. So you are also part of making this digital world as secure as the rest of us.
Yes, thank you, Christine. I think just reflecting on, just saying one word on what you said, and also what Francesca said earlier. So I think often, at least for me personally, when thinking of conflicts in the cyberspace and this whole digital dimension in peace and conflicts overall, I think it's easy to forget the humane aspect about it. So Francesca already mentioned it before. You mentioned it now, but there are always people behind cyber attacks and the instigation of conflict in the cyberspace. And therefore, well, I'd love to also believe in the idea that also conflicts in cyberspace can be resolved or prevented, as Janne highlighted, that it's important to put efforts in it. But therefore, as well, as many of us have heard it many times, but people are also the weakest link when it comes to protection. So it's also good to remember the human aspect in the protection side as well, that it's all our job to kind of do our best in order to solve this kind of conflicts and respond to attacks and whatnot. But then, Francesca, I'd love to give the floor to you once more. What are your reflections? What will be a final tip, and what are your thoughts on whether we can solve this?
Well, mission impossible after Janne and after Christine, I have to say. So thank you, Aino. No, excellent remarks. I can only add, let's say, one point. So I very much second what Christine was mentioning in terms of like be selectively, let's say, paranoid. so increase the level of awareness and understanding of the threats that you might be facing, and also be conscious about your, the responsibility of your actions in cyberspace, especially when conducting peacekeeping and peace mediation actions. Capacity building is key. Thanks, Janne, for stressing this out. Maybe the last point is routinely assessing the cyber threats in situational awareness. Too often still, when it comes to peacekeeping missions, and we've been discussing with many peacekeeping and mediation organizations, they receive often, let's say, physical threats briefings, but without the cyber dimension into it. This is key. At all levels, from UN level to, a local context, you absolutely need to be, let's say, cyber aware. And this should be taken at organizational and individual level. When it comes to, let's say, can a conflict be resolved? I would like to join, let's say, the positive crew. I would like just to mention maybe two suggestions. One, it's also, I think, very good what Janne mentioned about the risk regarding, for example, surveillance. And again, this is often overlooked. And on one hand, I'm glad that thanks to what happened with the NSO case and specifically with Pegasus, now we are talking about it in the different dimensions, including the peace mediation. I would like also to mention, for example, that peacemakers might also draw from a very rich research around, for example, internet shutdowns, and try to seek a commitment from the different parties to ensure that internet access remains open and uninterrupted. I know it seems, it goes without saying, but this is also a key element when we are thinking about responsible behavior in cyberspace. There are already, for example, UN guidelines on business and human rights. We have the Paris Call on Trust and Security in Cyberspace. And I think they very well outline already principles when it comes to protecting the internet and safeguarding civilians from harm. And then the last point that I would like to make is really to stress this do no harm principle. For example, when it comes to surveillance of mediators and the different stakeholders and protecting, for example, critical information infrastructure or infrastructure and providing essential services to the public, we really need to be, again, conscious about the, on one hand, as you very well mentioned, about the human-centric dimension of the cyber conflict, which means on one hand, humans are targeted, but also humans might be agents of change, and the do no harm principle is really something we need to stick to. Thanks.
Thank you, Francesca. Excellent final remarks. I really loved how you said, so let's now, all of us, let's be selectively paranoid and start our day by assessing the risks that we have in our work when it comes to cyber, to be able to truly respond to these and then build our capacities on cyber as well, so that we can protect ourselves, protect our work, protect the institutions that we work for, and then hopefully one day be able to find ending to conflicts in the cyberspace as well, or support in the processes of finding endings to conflicts in the cyberspace. It is time for us to end this webinar today. So thank you for all the participants joining. Thank you for all the panelists joining today. My name was Aino Piirtola and was CMI Martti Ahtisaari Peace Foundation, and I wish you all a very, very pleasant Friday and weekend. So thank you once more, Janne, Francesca, and Christine for joining the webinar today, and until next time.